Hey everyone, this is Jim Cowen from the Collaborative for Student Success. This is the Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery podcast. Each episode, we travel the country on a kind of road trip to talk about the ways public education is evolving and moving forward, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. Along the way, we hold up the best examples with the hope that those practices are repeated in other schools. Our guest today is Amanda Aragon, Executive Director of NMKidsCAN. So Amanda, I was looking at your bio, and you began your career in the private sector, the energy sector to be specific, before you actually entered the field of public education, where you saw the light clearly and accepted a strategic outreach position in New Mexico's public education department. That work must have definitely ignited a fire in you because you never turned back. And ultimately, you developed NMKidsCAN, which has done, continues to do, some really great work to help students, teachers, and parents in New Mexico. Thank you for joining us today for our K-12 podcast.
Thanks for having me. I guess we could call it seeing the light. I think my parents would disagree, but I'm very honored to be doing the work that I get to do every day.
That's awesome. To start off with, I'm just curious to hear more about why you entered the field in general. It takes a lot to start something like NMKidsCAN. So I'm just curious, like, was it your experience at New Mexico's public education department that got you going?
Yeah, it was, but I mean, honestly, it was a little bit before that. One, I'm a native New Mexican, so I experienced New Mexico public schools and in ways that I think a lot of families in America can relate to. In that, I'm very blessed to be around a huge family here in Albuquerque on both sides, and I was born in the part of town that my paternal grandparents live in, and all of my cousins on that side went to the same schools that their dads went to. We moved kind of west in Albuquerque, like, quote unquote, the better schools are further to the west side. So my mom was pretty adamant that we moved towards the west side when we started school. And so I did a little bit of school hopping as we moved. And then ultimately this new school district opened. It was brand new. It was great. And so we lied about our address for a little while and then ultimately bought a house in Rio Rancho. And I graduated from one of the best public high schools in New Mexico. So when I left for college, I was like, whoo, I got this. I'm ready. Like, let's do it. 5 freshmen from New Mexico at the University of Tulsa, which is where I went. And all of us really struggled. And so I think we all realized that when you graduate from even the best schools in a state that is at the time probably between 47th, 48th, 49th, 50th, there's a real impact there. So that stuck with me as I went into my private sector role. And then in the private sector, I got to do a lot of education grant making and just felt like we weren't moving forward as a state. And at that time, we were still in that wave of 2010 governors that were doing incredible stuff. So locally, it was Governor Martinez. And the politics around education in my home state, I didn't understand them. I had never seen such an ugly reaction from New Mexicans. And in this case, it was all directed towards Secretary Hannah Scandera. So I did a program called Leadership New Mexico where we got to hear from the public education department. And I was like, this makes no sense to me because what they're saying resonates with me as a student of New Mexico public schools. We have to do things differently. But everyone hates them. So I was like, that disconnect of what is going on here is what drew me into the work. That's what got me to go work at the public education department. I mean, that's really where I went from okay, I got to figure this out. And then once I was in, it was oh, this is a mess. And I can't imagine anything that would be more worthwhile than trying to improve education in my home state for all of the kids in New Mexico. And my family is still here. I have my brother's 5 children are in public schools in New Mexico. And so I want to have children here. So long answer.
It's a great answer. And looking at your website, I love the picture of you with your grandparents, with all 4 of your grandparents getting ready for graduation. So I think that's an awesome thing. And if you hadn't mentioned your grandparents, I was going to ping you on that going, no. We need to hear about the grandparents.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh man. I think it's so fascinating. The story of my grandparents, the story of family, the story that I think is common in some places in America, but not everywhere. New Mexico is a very generational state. Families have been here for generations. And so it plays a role into everything we do. I think New Mexico is about to restart school accountability for the first time in 4 years. Thank goodness. But when you identify as a school as low performing, I think the thing that we underestimated when I was at the department that we try and be very careful about now is there's like a real toll that comes with that for a family, because it's not just like, hey, the school that you sent your child to for the last few years is struggling. It's like the school that you sent your child to, the school that you went to, the school that your parents went to has now been identified and probably has been this challenged for a long time. Asking a family to reconcile decades and generations of being underserved, I think is like, I think we took that too lightly, and I think they need more support to navigate what that means for them, what the impact to their family has been, and how to move through it and past it. Their future generations something better, which I'm grateful for my grandparents always emphasizing how important education was and like doing everything they could to make sure we got what we needed.
Was there just in your mind like kind of a lack of trust after that too? Like, how do you regain trust in a bureaucracy, in a system that's supposed to help all kids?
Maybe we'll do this on our podcast actually, but I thought about like bringing in a psychologist, right? Because there's a psychology there that we're asking people to work through. And I think some of that pushback that we get, what I would call like the fair pushback, I think there's people that are opposed to school accountability no matter what. Like those people will probably never agree with. I think that's a very small amount of people. But then I think there's a group of people that just doesn't know how to get past like that emotional response, right? Like that, oh, how do I reconcile this? That like, this is a choice I made for my child, or the impact of, again, like a family generationally, like how do you make that up? And so I think sometimes instead of, when you don't have the tools to absorb that and like process it, it's easier to just be like, no, that can't be right. Like that school cannot be that bad. And I think that middle ground of diving into the nuance of that conversation, helping people understand it and how we can transform it, is really what I think New Mexico KidsCAN strives to do, but we could all, I think, do a better job at.
How does your chat, is it a chapter? Would I call it a campaign?
We call them campaigns.
Campaigns. How does it interact with like that kind of the larger 50CAN? And how terrible is it to work with someone like Darrell Bradford?
Oh man, Darrell. No, such an honor. You know, the 50CAN network is a gift in so many ways. And it's a gift that I don't talk about often, because I think when you're doing state advocacy work, the last thing people want to hear is that you're a part of a national network. Right. And I think the reason that is true is because very few national networks operate the way that 50CAN does. And so 50CAN, our like tagline is locally led, nationally supported. And when we say it, we mean it. So as the executive director in New Mexico, I call the shots for New Mexico. I decide what policies make sense for us to work on. I decide all of the day-to-day, like the actual work. On the back end, we have tremendous support from the national office in terms of, I mean, they do all the stuff I don't want to do. So like our audits and our accounting and our HR, like that, I get to do the work that I care about, and they make all the other work a lot easier. And then we have incredible thought partners like Darrell, like Mark, like Jonathan Nicola, that when we need help, we can call our other EDs, we can call the national team and be like, hey, can you help me think through this? Or how's your state thinking through this? And because we're also politically diverse, we can have really rich discussion about some of these political intersections that I think not every network gets to dive into, because maybe they align to like one political leaning over another, or set of policies over another, where we just have such a diversity in the network that we get to have really great conversations.
Yeah, you mentioned the policy side of this. So let's talk about the policy side in New Mexico a little bit. I'm curious of I asked you just to give me the take on the state of education in New Mexico right now, right? Like, what are the things that are the bright spots? What are the things that you are challenged by?
Yeah,
what would you say? And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like, what are students feeling? What are teachers feeling? What are parents feeling right now?
I'm a very optimistic person. so I struggle with this a lot because there are some good things happening, and I will get to the good things, but I think it is always really important to be very clear about where New Mexico is. And that is 50th overall, so last in the country, state by state. And when you look at 4th grade, 8th grade reading and math, we are last in every single one of those categories. And when we released, did all of our releases around the NAEP data this last cycle, we went back 20 years, and there have been times when New Mexico has been 50th for sure, but there has not been a time where New Mexico was 50th overall and 50th in all 4 categories at the same time. And that is where we are today. And so it is, I think, one of the most challenging times for education in New Mexico in my lifetime. I unfortunately think there is a resonant resistance to admit that. Which is why I feel it's so important to just say it out the gate. This is where we are. And there are some good things that are starting to happen. A legislator, one of the senators recently said, it feels like we're getting back to normal. And she's not talking COVID normal. She's talking about normal from 2018, 2019, which is I mentioned this earlier, we're about to start school accountability again. We have not run our school accountability system in 4 years. So how do parents feel? They don't know what to feel. They've gotten no information from our system in 4 years about their students' performance, about their school's performance. Many people have heard me talk about this before. Of course, we didn't test in 2020 like a lot of states, but we tested less than 10% of kids in 2021. So we had no usable data coming out of 2021. So it wasn't until last academic year that we got our first glimpse of data. So those systems are just coming back online, which is deeply frustrating, and also I'm grateful for it. So, right. Both and then we're funding education at greater levels than we ever have. We've put $1 billion for reference. There's 330,000 public school students in New Mexico. We've put $1 billion new dollars in the system over the last 4 years. So the money is there. Our funding formula is incredible. It's very equitable. It's not property tax based. We have a state equalization funding formula. So the components are there. Now it's okay, are we going to do right by our kids and take all these systemic components and layer them on to give our kids what we know they deserve in every classroom across the state?
So you guys set some really big policy goals, some ambitious goals. And I know the legislative session really just ended. I love how you guys set up. Daniel Macy from your team did a really great job in writing up these blogs on sort of the policy goals that you have all set. And then how did the legislative session end for you all, and where are you? And you were really honest in here too about how you talked through them. So one, I love how you were extremely explicit about what you were going after, and then the results at the end of the session. And I think you guys have a lot to be proud of, right out of the gate. For one, I noted that you guys you had the changing in your funding formula, right? So there's more money is going to kids who need it more. There's an increase of attention on instructional time in the classroom. That's fantastic. And then the literacy bill is huge. So I know that was your number one policy goal. What does it feel like to pass that, and kind of what's next? What, now that you've got it, what does it mean, and what's next on the policy on the literacy bill?
So the literacy bill is I think the perfect. Our comms guy Ned at 50CAN is gonna hate everything I'm about to say. But the literacy bill is the perfect example of policy being so important and such a challenge at the same time, right? So to be very transparent with everyone, we got our literacy bill passed, but we did not get money for it. So now we're in this really interesting place where we passed a bill that says that the state will pay for any district that wants to adopt early literacy materials aligned with the science of reading at no cost to the district. At any point in the adoption cycle. They don't have to wait for the next, 4 more years for the next ELA adoption. They can do it now and the state will pay for it. That's what the law says. But we need the money to go into the bucket to then pay for it. And so we're trying to get that money now through some transfers or philanthropic gifts if anyone, is listening and just has millions of dollars that they want to give us for that, that would be great. And so it's like, it's so good, right? Because you've got to move forward in some way, but sometimes you can't get everything at once. And this was a story of like, they wanted the language before they gave the money. And so it sets you back a year in a really frustrating way on a thing that everyone kind of agrees on. And so like, that's frustrating. So what we're moving towards now is creating a swell of support from the ground up so that that pressure is created for districts to adopt. When the money is there, they're like ready to go. And what that means is really giving parents the information they need to ask the questions that we think are the most important in terms of what materials are being used in my child's classroom to teach reading. And honestly, I love this podcast. I'm proud of our podcast, but I think we're all just like want to be Emily Hanford's. It's Sold a Story is just like the best thing to ever come to podcasts ever.
It is
and
fantastic.
So one of the things that we're doing is like, we can't tell that story better than Emily Hanford. So one of our literacy action steps right now is just trying to get parents to go listen to Sold a Story, because when you listen to it, you get it in a way that I could talk to you for 30 minutes and you're probably not going to get it the way you will if you listen to those 6 podcast episodes. So really trying to use the storytelling power of Sold a Story to get parents engaged. And then we come behind and say like, okay, here's the questions you can ask. Here's an email you can send to your child's principal. Here's how we can help you organize to attend the next school board meeting when we figure out what changes need to be made.
It's a great approach, and I completely agree. You've also mentioned your New Mexico Literacy Action Center. Like, how is that going to work?
It's interesting because I think policy organizations like ours oftentimes are like, action centers are about contacting your elected officials. And we are explicitly using our action center in a way that I think is a little different, which is what we're trying to do is get people to come on a journey with us, right? We know that I think about my own learning around early literacy, best practice, and the science of reading. And I remember, and I'll say this because I think it's an important tribute to make to something that happened the 1-year anniversary just a few weeks ago. I had been reading all the New York Times stuff, right? I had been listening to and reading the audio documentaries from Emily Hanford pre-Sold a Story, and was just like feeling very overwhelmed by this notion that if we as a society are arguing about the most basic thing about how we're going to teach our children to read, and this has become political and divisive, like, it makes all of the other work feel exceedingly overwhelming. Like, what are we doing? Like, if we can't figure this out, if we can't do this right, I was just feeling really overwhelmed. And it was actually the day of the Uvalde shooting that I had this like long Twitter thread that I was just getting ready to push that kind of crystallized my feelings and my thoughts around this, like, what are we doing? And obviously, when that tragedy happened, like, everything else kind of fell away, and you know, we as a country had to sit with another horrific school tragedy. But I think about, like, I didn't just get here overnight, right? So our New Mexico Literacy Center is really trying to help parents have that journey on their own, or community leaders, or whoever people are that are interested, to know, like, you're not going to read something one day and then suddenly be like, I'm ready to go. So what are all the things that we need to give people the opportunity to do and the time to do, and how do we keep them engaged along that cycle so that they can come on this journey with us? And so part of it is, like, you know, the first step is signing our literacy petition. And then we ask you to listen to the 6 like regular episodes of Sold a Story. And then the next step is listening to the 4 audio documentaries that came before Sold a Story. And then our podcast episode with a local teacher about how she used the science of reading in her classroom, and how she came to terms with, like, doing it the wrong way in her own classroom for 14 years. And so it's just like kind of breadcrumbs to tell people, like, hey, you don't have to eat the whole thing at once. Just like do a step at a time with us, knowing that this is going to take some time. But if people don't understand what the policy arguments are about, they're going to opt out of the conversation. So we have to help them understand both sides. Like, I want them to have a clear understanding of what critics of science of reading are saying, right? I want them to go in with a full knowledge and understanding of what we're asking our schools and teachers to do moving forward.
I think it's really a smart way to approach it too. We have had conversations with people from both Mississippi and Ohio around, their journey on science of reading and that reconciliation moment with teachers who have realized like they didn't know. They're doing what they thought was the right thing. It's a real sensitive thing to handle from a career standpoint for a teacher to keep them engaged and wanting to do the right thing and not feeling guilty about, you know, what had happened, and how the classroom instruction went before.
Yeah,
Um,
it breaks my heart.
yeah,
And that's another moment very similar to our conversation previously about school accountability, right? Where you're asking people to take on a pretty heavy emotional burden. And if you're not supporting them through that to say like, listen, you did the best you knew to do, and like you can't, isn't productive to like sit in that shame or sit in that like sadness. But like, how can we help you acknowledge that and move through it in a productive way? If you don't have that, it's easier to just be like, that can't be true. What I've
right.
been doing in my classroom can't be that bad for years. And now I'm thinking of hundreds of students whose names I probably remember. It's easier to just turn away from it. And so
Right.
I think we need to be, to your point, like very thoughtful and very compassionate about this conversation, especially for teachers, because
Yeah.
they have more of an emotional burden. I think them and parents, really have the biggest emotional burden in this conversation.
So I just got back from doing a long hike with my wife in Portugal and Spain, and a woman that we came across from Indiana, well, places on this hike. We struck up a conversation. We're talking about, what we each do, and she says, "Oh, you're in education." She goes, "You don't advocate for like sight reading and things like." I'm like, "No." She goes, "Because I did that. That was the way I was taught, and I had to reverse." Years of my education to get back on track. And I thought it was so random, like that this came up. It kind of emphasized that point of correction.
That
It
is
was
super random. I will say I'm driving my friends crazy, my friends and family that have young kids.
yeah,
I am like, you guys have to listen to this because you need to know, and this is what's hard about it, right? If you're a parent, you need to know what it sounds like for your child to be getting appropriate early literacy instruction. And you need to know what it sounds like when they're getting balanced literacy.
yeah,
And so the only way to do that, I think, is to really expose them. And again, like shout out to Soul the Story, when you hear children doing those things. Or
right.
one of the other parts of our action center that we're going to add is watching the Purple Challenge, which is a 2-part YouTube video that shows a mom like this is what balanced literacy looks like. This is how your kids might be tackling books at home, so that if a parent sees that, they're like, oh, I need to have a conversation with my child's teacher. Otherwise, it looks like they're reading fine. Like you wouldn't know there's a problem.
Right. One of the things I wanted to ask you about your policy is on use of stimulus funds. That's
Oof.
obviously a big thing that we have been pushing. We're trying to hold up the best examples. And I'll just say, like, I appreciate the wording you had in here too. And I know that, you all were raising the urgency of this and really encouraging the state, to spend down those last ESSER funds. There's only like 14 months left, to use them. And they should be going towards things that are really improving outcomes. There should be some accountability for this. So do you have any thoughts on that? Like as far as like what you would hope for in the future? Is there, you earlier you were sort of alluding to like we're just glad we got accountability back on the table, right?
I mean, it's interesting because when you ask that, the first thing that comes to my mind is like, well, I have a lot of PTSD from those hearings still. I think that these conversations around ESSER funds are really important because I think anytime you have an orientation towards what you and I are trying to do, which is like document how the money is being spent, look at what worked and what didn't, so that we can learn from it. A lot of people perceive that as us trying to like get you, right? Say like, oh, you spent that. I'm actually less interested in sitting around and being like, what a poor use of funds. I get it. Things were hectic. People were doing the best they can.
Right.
we're more interested in like, what can we learn from this? Like this was so much money. There's so many things we can learn. I'm not trying to make people feel bad for the choices they make. I'm trying to make sure that that when we spend all of this money, we have some information about what worked for kids so that we can do more of that. Like it's, right. And I think so much of this conversation, and particularly that bill hearing, gets lost in the like, you just want to make us feel bad. Like, but that is not it. So that accountability side for the purpose of doing what you guys are doing, which is like lifting up the best practices, both in your own state and in other places, to say what worked, like which vendors delivered, which programs worked, what was the structure, like tutoring is one thing, but then when you look at all the ways that people did tutoring in school, out of school, virtual, you couldn't see the camera, you could see the camera. We could spend years researching all of the tutoring and one-on-one interventions we did. And but we can't do any of that if we're not gathering information about it, both locally and nationally. And so our goal is very much to try and continue to work with the department, even though we didn't get our bill passed, to say, can we do some gathering of information to share out what worked?
Yeah. Well, we would love to continue working with you all. I know you've been a friend of the collaboratives for a long time, and we have appreciated promoting the great stuff that you're all doing. So hopefully we can continue to keep pressing on that for sure.
Well, likewise, I would always happy to be a friend of the collaborative, but I want to say, like, I'm a fan of the collaborative, right? I think we got to be honest about like some of the things that you and I like to talk about. People are just not as interested in talking about anymore. I know.
Like, it's kind of the nerdy side of
but it matters. Like these foundational parts of the system that allow all the cool stuff to happen on top. The cool stuff doesn't come if you don't have the foundational parts down. And so it's always an honor to be in the work with partners like you that are happy to talk about the not sexy foundational parts of the system that need to stay in tip-top shape so we can innovate on top.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to give you the last word. Anything else you want to offer on the way out of this episode?
Yeah, I think, and maybe this is a good circle back to like where we started. I started in this work because I realized when I was traveling the country that in a lot of other states, people in general are much more engaged in education than we were in New Mexico, that we were leaving it up to just state policymakers and assuming, hey, the Secretary of Education is going to take care of that. The legislature is going to take care of that. The governor is going to take care of that. And I would just say to everyone listening to this podcast, like, we all have a role to play in education. Like everyone, whether you're a business leader, a parent, an educator, a taxpayer, the system will only get better wherever you are if you are invested in it, if you're paying attention and using your voice and using your abilities to help lift the system up. So I would just encourage people to take a step this week or next week that does something to improve your local school, your local district, your state, whatever it might be. But there's a role for us all to play, and we all need to be actively engaged in that work.
You're here. Amanda Aragon, Executive Director at NMKidsCAN. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Jim Cowen from the Collaborative for Student Success. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Route K-12 Exploring Education Recovery, where we showcase ways public education is evolving by talking to the people doing the hard work to educate America's kids. Reach out to us at edurecoveryhub.org/podcast or follow us on Twitter at our handle, Student Success.